This presentation is about Gothic archetypes and their influence in a specific novel of Howard Phillips Lovecraft, which is the case of Charles Dexter Ward. Okay, so before starting, I would like to explain why did I choose this specific novel by Howard Phillips Lovecraft, taking into account that the format he mainly worked in was short stories. Okay. I think that Gothic archetypes are very influential throughout all of Lovecraft's work, but for the sake of clarity and to make this presentation more dynamic, I thought it would be more interesting to work with a specific novel. And as I would like to prove at the end of this presentation, the case of Charles Dexter Ward is almost a compendium on Gothic archetypes, okay? So in order to prove that, the first half of this presentation will be to make a fairly bulleted, very clear list of Gothic archetypes from both the European or traditional and the American Gothic tradition. Okay, why would I do that? Well, authors like Botting and Groom, which are very good scholars regarding the Gothic genre, explain them very thoroughly, but they end up being very abstract and very unclear in some of the ideas, which, taking into account the nature of the Gothic genre, might be the right way to explain the Gothic genre, but again, for the sake of clarity, I would rather have a bulleted list of Gothic archetypes, which, if any of you are studying with Raoul at the moment, might be very useful for your course. Okay? So I will start, as you see, with a very brief presentation on Howard Phillips Lovecraft and his work. I hope that most of you already at least have heard of them, and then delve into Gothic archetypes and finally the novel. Okay? So Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born in Providence, Rhode Island, in a very, let's say, aristocratic family in a way, and he was heavily influenced at a very early age by the huge library that his grandfather had in his house, and he got familiarized with the works of authors. What was the name? Sorry, I really forgot the name of this author. The Wings of Heaven and Hell. William Blake. With sorry. Yeah. So he got familiarized with the works of authors of this kind, and especially William Blake would be very influential in his career, in the sense that he decided that either he would be a writer or he wouldn't be anything in his life, which caused him to endure poverty, and yeah, it didn't go that well for him. So he began writing short stories for the Weird Tales magazine, which from which he barely earned any money enough to live. And after getting married for a short time and moving to New York with his wife named Sonia Green, he came back to Providence and worked on his first long novels, which are At the Mountains of Madness and The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. It is after his return to Providence when his literature flourishes, because at first he mainly cultivated short stories which were pretty oniric, and then he developed a very personal style of literature, very detective-esque, if you want to call it that way, in which a main character, either led by curiosity or the circumstances, ends up meeting a truth he can't understand, and that causes him madness, death, suicide, or all at the same time. Okay, and at the end of his career, he also developed the hobby of writing to other amateur authors, among them Robert E. Howard, the author of Conan the Barbarian, and he created a literary circle of amateur writers. It is actually these amateur writers who would, after his death, keep alive his tradition by collecting all his tales and creating the Arkham House Publishing Company, which was aimed mainly at publishing the works of Lovecraft. Okay? Now, let's get into Gothic archetypes. The two main ideas one must have when dealing with Gothic literature is that, first of all, it is a reaction to the Enlightenment. During the Enlightenment, scholars thought of the classical past of Europe, the Roman and Greek past of Europe, as the pinnacle of civilization, of what men could achieve. And these authors felt rather compelled by the medieval Gothic past of Europe. And their works revolved around that idea. The second idea we must have in mind is that regardless of the time period, either if it's European or American, the Gothic genre is unified by the will of exploring the social taboos of each time, okay? So the first archetypes are pretty self-explanatory, okay? Gothic literature has a very characteristic atmosphere and scenery. We're talking about very obscure, very somber and dark settings, which serve a double purpose. First of all, we can consider this kind of atmosphere as a poetical metaphor of the reaction against the Enlightenment, but also help suspend the disbelief of the reader. And as a matter of fact, most of the traditional Gothic tales are set in these sceneries typical of medieval Europe. We're talking about castles, cemeteries, monasteries, abbeys, etc. Okay? So, again, we can consider passion another reaction to the Enlightenment. At that time, rationality was considered the most important trait, and in Gothic literature, most of characters are driven by passion rather than reason, which ultimately also causes their downfall. Okay, their passion is also the cause of their damnation. Okay, another self-explanatory topic, which is the damsel in distress. It is very typical to find in Gothic literature the idea of a damsel that is deprived, overall deprived of her free will, either by being forced to marry someone they don't want, or kidnapped, or in the case of, for example, Matthew Ye Lewis's The Monk, there's a woman who's thrown into a dungeon, and where she gives birth and she watches the corpse of his newborn baby rot. It's very shocking. Okay, I entitled this archetype family, but there is a specific trait of family I want to talk about, or I want to underline, because family is a very multidimensional archetype, but the idea of inherited sin, which can be traced back to the Bible and the original sin, but in Gothic literature takes the form of family curses, okay? The many characters in Gothic literature somehow inherit the wrongdoings of their parents, and they pay a price for them. Finally, the supernatural and the sublime. I know that these two ideas are not necessarily the same, but I thought they were related somehow. We understand the supernatural as opposed, we understand the sublime as opposed to the beautiful, which is aesthetically pleasing, by that which due its immensity and obscurity, it's in a way compelling, but we also know it might destroy us. And the supernatural phenomena we can find in Gothic literature, either if it's the supernatural apparition of the armored giant in the castle of Otranto, or ghosts, are in a way sublime in nature. Okay. So these were the traditional Gothic archetypes, and now let's get into the American Gothic. Again, there is a main idea we must have in mind with dealing with American Gothic, and together with the development of the novel as a format, the main cause of change in the Gothic as a genre is the lack of contact with antiquity that Americans have when writing. Didn't make any sense, didn't make too much sense still write about castles and abbeys when they couldn't find that kind of sceneries around them. So we will talk later about this kind of displacement. First, I would like to talk about the human psyche. So in the American Gothic genre became really popular to portray the depths of the human psyche, not the cause, not so much the cause of horror in the characters, but also what the characters are feeling inside when facing this horror. Many authors dealt with this idea before him, but the man who canonized this idea as an American Gothic genre was Edgar Allan Poe, and a specific trait he developed, which is the acuteness of senses. I believe, Lovecraft himself argued that the rest of American Gothic authors back then had, in a way, to fall in line and also use these archetypes in order to compete in the literary market. This is very interesting, the balance between the natural and the supernatural. We have examples in the classical Gothic literature of novels such as The Mysteries of Udolpho, in which all the supernatural phenomena that takes place in the novel at the end have a very perfectly explainable cause, a very rational explanation. And on the other hand, other tales like The Castle of Otranto, which implies abnormal apparitions, etc. But it becomes very popular in the American Gothic genre to leave that to the author's interpretation. To let the reader decide if what the character saw was supernatural or not. Now, this is what I was talking about in the introduction. The space-time displacement, this is what I like to call the passage from the castle to the manor. It didn't make much sense to place these tales in a medieval Europe anymore. And I believe that horror, either if it's in the Gothic genre or in the modern Gothic genre, it's in constant evolution. And suddenly stories that took place in the medieval Europe didn't scare the reader anymore. It had to take place in a closer context to the reader, and this served this purpose. Finally, the community. This is an archetype I realized it was an archetype while doing the research. It's a very common idea in the American Gothic genre, the idea of these very closed and heavily religious communities in which religious officials, as the minister, have almost political power, and at the end, it's not the government or any sort of law, it is actually the village who decides the fate of some of the characters. Now, about the case of Charles Dexter Ward, before we start pointing out the Gothic archetypes or the lack of them in this novel, well, I think it's interesting to mention that he didn't actually like his own novel, and it was published by this close circle of amateur writers who kept his legacy alive. But I will go back to that later, okay? So I decided to divide this part of the presentation in 3 parts, actually 4. There is a prologue. But the novel has 5 chapters, but these 5 chapters are heavily focalized, mainly through 3 main characters, Joseph Curwen, Charles Dexter Ward, and Dr. Marinus Willett. I think this is a very relevant factor in the novel, and that's why I decided to structure the novel this way. Okay. So in this prologue, we are first introduced to the character of Charles Dexter Ward, which is suffering a very strange disease. That's the way we are introduced to him. And this takes us back to the archetype of the balance between natural and supernatural, because even though the description of the disease is pretty medical, it is not clear if it's natural or supernatural in nature. And the other archetype we can find in the introduction is the very elaborate and very obscure description that Howard Phillips Lovecraft made about Providence, which was his hometown, by the way. We can also link this to the idea of the space-time displacement, because in the description, the past and the present of Providence get blend together. In a way, Lovecraft sets his work in the 1920s Providence and goes back to the 18th century Providence. He's using 18th century Providence the same way classical Gothic authors used medieval Europe. Okay, that's the idea. So in the first arc of this novel, so to call it, we are introduced to Howard Phillips Lovecraft's ancestor, a man called Joseph Curwen, which were described as a necromancer or some kind of sorcerer. And there is a specific mention of the Salem witch hunt, which is a very interesting way Lovecraft has to link this novel with real events. We can also find the archetype of the damsel in distress. This necromancer, in order to improve his public image, decides to marry, against the will of the woman, of course, a young woman called Elisa Chillingast, which causes the previous fiancé of this woman to investigate what is Joseph Curwen doing. And after proving to the village that he's involved in very strange rituals, it is the entire city of Providence who judges him and decides to assault the farm where he lives. We are not at that moment described of what horrors the people of Providence discover in Joseph Curwen's catacombs, but they end up with a terrible psychological drama, which we can link to the very detailed description of the human psyche. This is another archetype. Then we are introduced to the character who gives title to the novel, which is Charles Dexter Ward, which is a descendant of Charles Dexter Ward, of Joseph Curwen. Before dying, Joseph Curwen performs some kind of ritual, and when Charles Dexter Ward, who is a very passionate, well, I call him historian, but he's actually a genealogist. He's very interested in the past of his family. When he discovers he's a descendant from Joseph Curwen and finds his portrait, there is a very unnatural resemblance, okay? They look quite exactly the same. So the idea of the curse is already patent. And along with the portrait, Charles Dexter Ward also discovers the journal notes and letters of Joseph Curwen, and he becomes obsessed not anymore with genealogy or history, but with the very topics that Joseph Curwen was interested in, which is necromancy, sorcery, and that kind of things. So his travels for some time in Europe, studying more deeply this kind of topics, and after his return to Providence is the last time we read this novel focalized through Charles Dexter Ward. Now it's time for the family physician, which is Dr. Marinus Willett. And this arc begins with the resurrection of Joseph Curwen, which was what the diaries and the notes were for his descendant to bring him back to life. Essentially, what Charles Dexter Ward has done is bring back to life a doppelganger, someone that looks exactly like him and actually kills him and takes his place. But Dr. Marinus Willett notices that there is something unnatural going on with Charles Dexter Ward and decides to investigate the farm that many centuries ago was assaulted by the people of Providence, and goes into the catacombs, which are another Gothic archetype by themselves. So what Dr. Willett finds in the catacombs, it's very complicated to describe. It is probably the most modern form of horror that we can find in this novel. Inexplicable horrors are a very important part in Lovecraft's literature, and there is a specific linking with Lovecraft's canonical pantheon of elder gods by mentioning Yog-Sothoth. Anyway, what Dr. Marinus Willett finds in the catacombs cause him to endure a very severe madness, which takes us back to the Gothic archetype, but at the end he is able to destroy Joseph Corbin. Now, in conclusion, I mentioned before that Howard Phillips Lovecraft didn't actually like this novel. And he actually described it as a cumbrous, creaking bit of self-conscious antiquarianism. And I think that is precisely because, unlike other of his works, in which, since they are short tales, Gothic archetypes are frequent, but not as much, this is almost a compendium, as if Lovecraft decided to put in a single novel everything he knew about Gothic literature, but in a way adapting it to his own times, helping to create modern horror as we know it today. And that's pretty much it. Thank you.